The morning my sister moved back home was the morning I should have packed my bags and never looked back. I didn't, of course. I was 26, working a teaching assistant job that barely covered my car payment, and my parents had offered me the spare bedroom in their house for a reduced rent while I finished my master's degree. It seemed practical at the time. It seemed like the kind of compromise reasonable adults make. I didn't understand yet that moving back into a house where no one had ever truly seen me was not a compromise. It was a surrender. My sister was 4 years older than me and had always occupied a different atmosphere in our family. She was the one who graduated early, the one who got the scholarship, the one whose name was mentioned at dinner parties with a kind of reverence I used to think was normal. When she announced she was moving back after a painful divorce, my parents didn't hesitate. Her old bedroom was redecorated within a week. New curtains, a reading chair, a small vanity she'd always wanted. My room had the same water-stained ceiling tiles it had when I was 15. I want to be fair. My sister could be charming, generous even, in the ways that counted publicly. She remembered birthdays. She sent flowers when friends lost parents. She had this way of making people feel chosen when she turned her attention to them. But behind closed doors, in the specific language of sisterhood that only the two of us shared, she had always been something else entirely. A hand that pushed, instead of steadied. A voice that laughed at the wrong moment. A presence that made rooms feel smaller. Growing up, I had learned to move carefully around her moods. She didn't hit me, not in the ways that leave visible marks. She shoved. She grabbed. She had this particular technique of gripping my forearm and twisting, slowly, while smiling, watching my face for the exact moment I would break and ask her to stop. When I did, she would let go and say she was just playing around, that I was so sensitive, that I needed to toughen up. My parents, if they witnessed any of it, would sigh and tell us to stop bickering. They never seemed to see what I saw, which was that it was never bickering. It was only ever her doing something to me, and me asking her to stop. I had been living back home for about 7 months when she moved in. For the first few weeks, things were surface level fine. She was processing the divorce. She was sad. She was subdued in a way I had never seen her. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The shift happened gradually, the way it always had. Small comments at dinner. Observations about my clothes, my job, my relationship with my boyfriend at the time. She had always had a gift for framing cruelty as concern. She wasn't insulting me. She was worried about me. She wasn't dismissing my choices. She was offering perspective. My parents nodded along. They always had. By month 2 of us living under the same roof again, the physical stuff had started back up. It was never dramatic enough to name out loud. A hard bump into my shoulder as she passed in the hallway. A shove disguised as playfulness when I was standing near the kitchen counter. Once, when I was carrying a full laundry basket down the stairs, she walked out of her room and walked directly into me, hard enough to send me stumbling forward. I caught myself on the railing. She laughed and said she hadn't seen me there. I told my boyfriend about it, and he looked at me the way people look when they are trying to decide if you are being rational. He said she was probably going through a hard time. He said maybe I was reading into things because of history. I stopped telling him after that. What happened on the Sunday in late October started the way most of those moments did, which is to say it started with something that could be explained away. I was coming down the stairs with my laptop bag over one shoulder and a travel mug in my hand. It was early, not quite 7 in the morning, and I was heading to campus to work in the library before my first class. My sister was on her way up. She had that expression she got sometimes, tight and flat, the one that appeared when she had decided something without telling me what it was. I moved to the right side of the stairs to give her room. She kept walking toward the center. I said good morning. She didn't answer. I was on the 4th step from the bottom when her shoulder connected with mine. Not accidentally, not the way bodies brush in a narrow space, but deliberately, angled, with force behind it. The laptop bag swung out and pulled me off balance. I reached for the railing and missed. I remember the particular quality of that half second when you know you are going to fall and there's nothing left to do but fall. I went down the remaining 4 steps sideways, my right wrist hitting the edge of the bottom step first, then my hip, then my shoulder slamming into the floor at the base of the staircase. My travel mug hit the wall and left a coffee stain that would stay there for weeks, long after everything else had changed. The pain in my wrist was immediate and absolute. I sat on the floor at the bottom of the stairs and held my arm against my chest and tried to breathe. My sister stood at the top of the staircase looking down at me. "You really need to be more careful," she said. "You're always rushing." My mother appeared from the kitchen doorway, drawn by the noise. She looked at me on the floor, at my sister at the top of the stairs, and she asked what happened. "She lost her footing," my sister said. "I didn't lose my footing," I said, my voice shaking. She walked into me. My mother looked between us the way she always had, weighing us on scales that had never been balanced. She sighed. "Can you both please not do this before 8 in the morning? I need to go to the hospital," I said. "I can't move my fingers." "You probably just jammed them. Put some ice on it, Mom." "I cannot move my fingers." My father came in from the garage. He looked at the scene and I watched his face arrange itself into the expression I had seen my entire life. The one that meant I was about to become the problem. He asked what I had done now. What I had done. I drove myself to the urgent care clinic because no one offered to take me, and my pride, by that point, would not allow me to ask. The clinic was a 10-minute drive, and I made it with my right hand in my lap and my left hand on the wheel, which in retrospect was not safe, and I do not recommend it. The woman at the front desk took one look at my wrist and moved me to a room quickly. The doctor who came in was a compact, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who introduced herself and then asked me directly what had happened. I told her I fell down the stairs. She examined my wrist without saying anything for a moment. Then she asked if I wanted to tell her how I really fell down the stairs. I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The pattern of the injury," she said carefully. "The way the bones have compressed. It's not entirely consistent with a falling reflex. When people fall, they tend to brace with their palms. This looks more like a direct impact." She paused. "Has anyone hurt you?" Something moved through me that I didn't have language for at the time. I said I lived with my sister. I said she had walked into me on the stairs. I said my parents thought I had just lost my footing. She nodded slowly and ordered x-rays. The x-rays were where everything changed. She came back into the room with the films in a quieter manner than she'd had before. She pulled up a chair, which I had not expected, and she sat down across from me rather than standing in the doorway, the way doctors sometimes do when they are about to tell you something brief. She said my wrist had 2 fractures, a distal radius fracture, and a smaller fracture along the ulna styloid. Both were consistent with impact, rather than bracing. That was difficult enough to hear. Then she said there was something else. She said the x-rays showed evidence of an older injury to the same wrist, a healed fracture that had never been properly treated. She could tell by the way the bone had knit back together, slightly misaligned, in a way that only happened when a fracture was left to heal on its own without reduction or casting. She asked when I had injured my wrist before. I sat there for a long time. I remembered being 19 and telling my mother my wrist hurt so badly I couldn't grip a pencil. I remembered her saying I had probably sprained it doing something careless. I remembered my sister the week before that, the same grip she had always used, the forearm twist she thought was funny, except that times something had cracked, and the pain had been different, and I had cried for 2 days, while my parents told me to take some Advil. I told the doctor all of it. Not just that incident, but the pattern of it. The shoves. The stairs. A time in college when I visited home for spring break and my sister yanked me by the arm hard enough that I felt something tear in my shoulder, and my father told me I was being dramatic when I said it still hurt 3 weeks later. I sat in that urgent care clinic room, and I said things out loud that I had been storing silently for 15 years, and the doctor wrote every single word down. She said she was required to file a report with social services given the evidence of chronic untreated injury combined with my account of ongoing physical harm in the home. She said I could refuse her referral to the hospital social worker, but she strongly encouraged me not to. I did not refuse. The social worker's name was Diane, and she was one of those people who make you feel heard without performing it. She sat with me for over an hour. She asked questions I had never been asked before. Not in a clinical way, but in the way of someone genuinely trying to understand the shape of a thing. At the end, she said something that I have thought about almost every day since. She said that what I had described was not bickering. It was not sibling rivalry. It was a sustained pattern of physical harm that had been minimized, dismissed, and enabled by the adults who were responsible for protecting me. She said the old healed fracture was, in her experience, exactly the kind of evidence that changed how authorities looked at a situation. I was referred to an orthopedic specialist for the wrist, and I was given information about filing a police report. I went home that night with a splint on my arm and a clarity I had not known before, which felt less like relief and more like the moment your eyes adjust to a room that was always dark. I filed the police report 2 days later. The officer who took my statement was young, younger than me, and I could see him working to keep his face neutral as I laid out the timeline. He took the urgent care records. He took the contact information for the clinic doctor. He said they would be in touch. What I had not prepared myself for was my parents' response when they found out. My father called me while I was at work, and he did not raise his voice, which somehow made it worse. He said I had gone too far this time. He said my sister was going through a divorce, and I was making everything about myself the way I always did. He said the family did not need this kind of drama. He said the word drama, the way he had always said it, like a diagnosis, like proof of a deficiency in me, rather than a description of the situation. My mother texted me later that night. The text said that she hoped I understood what I was putting the family through, and that my sister was devastated, and that I needed to think carefully about whether this was the kind of story I really wanted to tell. I read that text several times. I thought about the healed fracture in my wrist, the one that had spent 7 years slightly misaligned because no one had believed it was broken. I thought about whether that was the kind of story I really wanted to tell. It was. The investigation took 3 months. During that time, I moved out of my parents' house and into a 1-bedroom apartment that I could barely afford. My boyfriend and I broke up, partly because of the stress and partly because he still seemed to think I was constructing a narrative out of grievance. I went to physical therapy twice a week for my wrist. I went to a therapist named Dr. Okafor once a week for everything else. Dr. Okafor was the first person outside of that urgent care clinic who named what had happened to me without qualification. She said my sister's behavior had been physically abusive. She said my parents' responses had been a form of enabling that crossed, in her professional opinion, into negligence. She said the reason I had spent 30 years doubting my own perception of events was because I had been systematically taught to. She called it a specific kind of conditioning, the kind that makes a person distrust their own nerve endings. She said, people carry that kind of damage the way they carry any other injury, invisibly, until something external makes the invisible visible. The X-rays had made the invisible visible. My sister was charged with misdemeanor assault and battery. Given the documented history I had provided, the DA pushed for a felony charge of domestic violence with bodily injury. But the misdemeanor was what stuck after the preliminary hearing. My attorney, who came recommended by the social worker Diane, told me not to be discouraged. She said the criminal charge was only one part of what we were doing. The civil case was the other part. I want to explain this clearly, because it is the part that I have found most people don't know is possible. When someone causes you physical harm that results in medical expenses, lost income, and documented ongoing suffering, you can sue them in civil court, regardless of what happens in criminal court. The standard of proof is different. You don't need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. You need to prove by a preponderance of the evidence, which means more likely than not. I had X-rays showing an old, untreated fracture caused by physical violence in my childhood home. I had a new fracture caused by a deliberate act on the stairs. I had a doctor's report, a social worker's assessment, a police report, and 15 years of a pattern that my therapist was prepared to testify about. My attorney told me with measured satisfaction, a very solid case. My parents were named as co-defendants. The theory was straightforward. They had known about ongoing physical harm and had not only failed to seek medical treatment for me when I was a minor, but had actively discouraged me from seeking it as an adult, up to and including my mother's text message telling me to think carefully about the story I wanted to tell. My attorney printed that text message out and put it in a folder. The criminal case resolved first. My sister pleaded no contest to the misdemeanor charge and received 2 years of probation, mandatory anger management counseling, and a restraining order. No prison time. I sat in the courtroom and watched the judge sign the paperwork, and I felt the familiar swell of frustration that I had seen in the comments of other people's stories, the sense that the system had weighed the harm and found it lighter than it was. But my attorney had told me to wait. She had told me the civil case was where the weight would land. She was right. The civil trial took place 8 months after the criminal resolution. My sister's attorney tried the approach I had anticipated, which was to paint the incident on the stairs as an accident, and my account of childhood abuse as a reinterpretation of ordinary sibling conflict. He used the word dramatic twice in his opening statement. I noticed the jurors' faces when he said it. Several of them shifted in their seats. The orthopedic specialist testified about the old fracture, she explained, using imaging displayed on a large screen for the jury. Exactly what a healed, but nutter-treated fracture looked like, versus a fracture that had received proper care. She explained the degree of pain that fracture would have caused at the time of injury. She explained that a parent or guardian presented with a child experiencing that level of pain in a limb would, under any reasonable standard, have sought medical evaluation. The defense had no strong counter to this. There is no good rebuttal to a bone that healed wrong. Dr. Okafor testified about the psychological impact of growing up in an environment where pain is consistently minimized and disbelieved. She was careful and clinical, and she never overreached. But the jury understood what she was saying. She was saying that I had been taught to be my own worst witness. She was saying that was not an accident. My parents testified. My mother cried on the stand, which I had expected. My father was composed, which I had also expected. Neither of them seemed to understand that composure, in this context, did not read as credibility. It read as a family that had practiced a story for a long time. The jury deliberated for 2 days. The verdict was in my favor, on all counts. My sister was found liable for the injuries sustained on the stairs, the documented aggravation of the pre-existing wrist injury, and for the pattern of physical harm established through the medical evidence. My parents were found liable for negligence in failing to provide medical care for a minor in their custody and for their ongoing conduct in discouraging me from seeking care and reporting harm as an adult. The total judgment was significant. I will not state the exact figure, because my attorney advised against it, and I have chosen to follow that advice. But I will say it covered my medical expenses, my physical therapy, a full year of mental health treatment, 2 years of lost teaching income during the period when my injury affected my ability to work, and damages for pain and suffering that the jury determined were appropriate given the duration and documentation of the harm. My sister's attorney appealed. The appeal was denied. My parents did not appeal. I think by then they understood that any further legal proceeding would only generate more documentation of what they had allowed to happen in that house for 30 years. The felony civil judgment attached to my sister's record. My parents, both retired, faced the judgment with assets that made the payment complicated but ultimately unavoidable. My father called me once, several months after the verdict, and said that he had never meant for things to go this far. I asked him what he had meant for instead. He didn't have an answer. I told him I didn't need one anymore. It has been almost 3 years now. My wrist will never be quite what it was before the fall. I have some restriction in my range of motion on the right side that my physical therapist says is likely permanent given the layering of the 2 injuries. The old one and the new one on top of it. I wear a brace on cold days. I have learned to grade papers left-handed when the aching gets bad. I still teach. I moved from the teaching assistant position into a full-time role at a middle school, which is not where I imagined myself, but turns out to be exactly where I belong. 12 and 13-year-olds are perceptive in ways adults have often forgotten how to be. They know when something is unfair. They know when they are being told that what they felt didn't happen. I try to be the kind of teacher who does not tell them that. I think about Diane, the social worker, often. I have looked her up and I know she still works at the same clinic. I sent her a letter when the civil verdict came in. I don't know if she remembered me among all the cases she has handled over the years, but I needed her to know that the thing she had done, which was simply to sit down and listen and take notes and hand me a pamphlet and a referral and say you have options, had changed the entire direction of my life. That is not a small thing to have done for a person. My sister and I have not spoken. The restraining order expired after 2 years and was not renewed because I no longer needed the legal protection, only the physical distance. She sent a message through a mutual family friend about a year after the verdict. The message did not include the word sorry. It said she hoped I understood that none of this had been intentional. I thought about responding for a long time. I thought about the grip on my forearm when I was 12, the stairs at 19, the stairs at 26, the bone that healed crooked for 7 years because no one believed it was broken. I did not respond. My mother still sends me cards on my birthday. They are always store-bought, the kind with a nature scene on the front and a generic sentiment printed inside. And she signs them with her first name now rather than Mom, as if we are acquaintances who once had something in common. I keep them in a drawer. I'm not entirely sure why. Something about the evidence of a thing, I think. Something about the record. There is a moment in physical therapy that my therapist, a pragmatic former athlete named Greg, used to describe as the window. He said it was the point in recovery when the injured tissue was healed enough to work but not yet compensating, when you had the clearest picture of what you had actually lost and what you still had. He said most people found it discouraging, but that it was actually the most important moment, because it was the only time you were seeing the truth without the body's protections over it. I think about that window a lot when I think about my family. For most of my life, I had been in the compensating stage. I had learned to hold my arm at an angle that didn't hurt. I had learned to carry the weight differently so it didn't show. I had become so practiced at the adjustments that I couldn't tell anymore what the original shape of things had been. It took a fall down 4 stairs and an X-ray and a doctor who pulled up a chair to get me to the window. What I saw there was not what my family had always told me I would see, which was a dramatic, oversensitive woman who struggled with ordinary conflict. What I saw was someone who had been hurt and taught to call it something else for so long that she had almost believed it. The X-ray doesn't lie. The bone tells the truth even when everyone around the bone is still arguing about what happened. That image, the slightly thickened line where the fracture had knit together wrong, is in my medical file in a manila folder in a drawer at an orthopedic clinic across town. Most days, I don't think about it, but on the days when I feel the ache in my wrist and catch myself wondering if I am making too much of something small, I remember that it exists. I remember that the record is there. You are not making too much of it. The bone remembers, even when you have been trained to forget. And sometimes all it takes is one person in a clinical room who pulls up a chair instead of standing in the doorway, who asks the right question in the right tone of voice to make sure the record finally gets written down correctly. I was believed. It took an X-ray and a civil verdict and 3 years of my life to get there. But I was believed, and I have spent every day since trying to make sure the children in my classroom know they don't have to wait that long.